Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well. So I'm back this week with another true crime case. However, this case is solved. This case is absolutely unbelievable. It's actually really affected me working on this case. Sometimes that happens and I just feel so many emotions for the victims in these cases. Today we're talking about the heartbreaking abduction of Stephen Stayner, but also his incredible journey throughout and the events of what happened after. So I'm really excited to tell you the case of Stephen Stayner today. Stephen Stayner was born on the 18th of April in 1965 and he was born in Merced, California. He was born to his parents Delbert and Kay, and he was actually one of 5 siblings, so quite a big family. He had an older brother named Carey and he had 3 younger sisters, so he was always very close with Carey because he was the only other boy in the family and he was a few years older, so they always had a very close relationship. So at the time of this case, Stephen was just 7 years old, so he was a very small child and he had the luxury of being able to walk home from school by himself. He went to school at Charles Wright in Merced, and the school he went to was only half a mile away from his home. So by the age of 7, his parents decided to let him walk home because it was a really short walk. So this is something that he did every single day without fail. But that all changed one day on December 4th, 1972. So as he started to leave school and walk down the road on the way back to his house, a strange man around his 30s to 40s approached Stephen, and he was carrying Bible leaflets and stuff to do with the church. And he stopped Stephen and he asked if his mum would be interested in donating anything to the church. And Stephen knew that his mum was quite a giving woman and this is something that she would be interested in. So because of that, he told the strange man, yeah, my mum probably would. So the strange man then proceeds to ask Stephen if he could take him home so that he could go and meet his mum and get the money or donations. So he essentially offered him a ride home to make it easier for Stephen, and then while doing that he would take the donations. And that is when he agreed and followed the man into the road into a white car with another man inside ready to drive off. Unfortunately, what little Stephen didn't know there and then is that his life would then change forever, and for the next 7 years he would be put through complete hell. So the car began driving. The first guy that went up to Stephen was in the passenger side, and then there was another man driving. And as they started to drive, they went past Stephen's house and he pointed this out and said that's where he lives. But they ignored him and they carried on driving. And I can only imagine the fear that he had when he realised that he wasn't actually being driven home. So there was 2 men in the car. The man that approached Stephen was a man named Edwin Murphy. I think he was between his 30s and his 40s, and he was described by people that knew him as a naive, simple-minded man, and he had learning difficulties. And although he was the absolute weirdo that lured Stephen into the car, the real mastermind behind this whole plan was a 34-year-old man who was in the driver's seat named Kenneth Parnell. Kenneth Parnell was actually a registered sex offender. He had a pretty crazy past and he wasn't a very nice man. His dad left when he was really young, around 6 years old, and this kind of just spiraled him into becoming extremely troubled and being quite volatile as he got older. He was constantly in and out of mental health institutions and he had a really bad temper. In March 1951, he was arrested for sodomizing a young boy, and he was also charged with impersonating a police officer with a badge. He did this to lure the little boy into his trap. He was arrested for this later, and he was arrested for 4 years, but he actually escaped prison. He was later recaptured and then put back into prison, but he didn't serve much time for this at all. In a 2000 interview with Kenneth about why he did this to this little boy, he said that his wife, his current wife at the time, was actually pregnant at the time, and he needed a release or another outlet for his sexual desires. He claimed to have been married up to 3 times and even had children with these women, but his relationships never really worked out because obviously he is an absolute weirdo and has major problems, but he was arrested for many things like robbery, impersonating a police officer and molesting a child, and he was even labelled a sexual psychopath. So it's crazy that he was just allowed to go on and live his life after committing such horrible crimes. So Kenneth and Edwin met at work. They worked at Yosemite National Park. And because of Edwin being simple-minded and being quite naive, Kenneth Parnell, when he met him, took advantage of this and basically started to manipulate him into being friends with him and doing favours for him, essentially. So that's why he recruited Edwin to abduct a child for him. And what he actually told Edwin, the reason for doing so, was because he was an aspiring minister. He was a man of God, and he wanted to have a child of his own to raise in a religious type ordeal, which sounds crazy to most people, but because Edwin did have learning difficulties and he was very trusting, bless him, he obviously didn't realise the severity of what he was being asked to do. Not that that's an excuse for him at all. He obviously must have known it was wrong, but I think he was very easily manipulated into doing something like that, which is why it actually worked. And this way, Kenneth didn't have to be seen doing it himself. He had someone else to cover for him, essentially. So as you probably guessed, Kenneth Parnell has abducted Stephen and is driving him the 38 miles away from where he lives to his cabin in Caffey's Valley, and Stephen does not return home. So after some time, his parents become very worried as the child is not home after school, and they contact the police, and obviously police look into this straight away. But strangely enough, no one at the school actually saw little Stephen get into a car, so no one had any eyewitness accounts of this, which made it really difficult for police. At some point shortly after Stephen's abduction, Kenneth actually proceeded to tell Stephen that his parents didn't want him anymore and that his parents couldn't afford him, so that Kenneth has taken over and is basically going to be his legal guardian, and that he now has to call Kenneth his dad. And being a 7-year-old child, that must have been so hard to hear, but also because he was so young, he probably believes Kenneth because he's an adult and he doesn't have anyone else there for him. So he eventually started to believe this was the case and that Kenneth was now his new dad. Upon arriving at Kenneth's cabin in Caffey's Valley, unfortunately, Kenneth began molesting Stephen, and then this continued for weeks, months and years until this just became Stephen's new reality. He constantly brainwashed Stephen into believing that his parents didn't want him and that he was his now dad. So he began changing everything about Stephen, including his name. So he told Stephen that his new name was going to be Dennis Parnell, so he should forget the name Stephen and he would go on as Dennis. And crazily, only after 1 month, Kenneth enrolled Stephen into school under the name of Dennis Parnell. He also gave him a dog to keep him company and to have a companionship with, which again just furthers the sort of brainwashing and manipulation that he put on Stephen. And he obviously succeeded in the brainwashing because when Stephen went to school as Dennis Parnell, he didn't tell anyone about what had happened to him. When Stephen was 9 years old, a woman named Barbara Matthias actually moved in with Kenneth and him, and it's not clear as to whether this was a relationship that Kenneth had or if it was a friend, but unfortunately this woman moved in for 18 months. She claimed that later on that she didn't know Stephen was an abducted child, but she actually joined in on sexually abusing him up to 9 times in the 18 months that she was there, which is just unfathomable as to how she could do that to a 9-year-old child who's already been abused by another man. The pair frequently moved, so they would move all around California into different states, and Stephen would constantly change schools. I think this was so that Kenneth could kind of avoid anyone figuring out who he was. So there was constant change in Stephen's life as he was growing up in this reality. And when Stephen turned around 13, he was actually encouraged to grow up and drink and smoke. He could come and go as he pleased. He could leave the house. He could go out all night. He could do whatever he wanted. And as he got older into his teenage years in school, he was actually described as popular, funny, and very normal. His friends that he made had no idea about the dark secret that he was keeping, and he even had a girlfriend at one point, and he didn't even tell her. I think that he actually started to take on this new identity, and he actually completely forgot who he was before and his family. At this point, he's almost been with Kenneth longer than he was with his family, and it's just so crazy to try and think about being him and being in that frame of mind and how you would feel about the situation. It's just absolutely insane. As I was saying, because he had all this freedom to come and go and drink and party and stuff, it's crazy. He never tried to leave, not once. Kenneth would go to work. He would work all of these odd jobs. He'd do night shifts and whatnot. And Stephen was just coming in and out of the house, and he didn't once try to leave. He later said that that was just not an option for him. It sounds crazy to a lot of people, but what was probably happening was like a case of Stockholm syndrome. If you don't know what that is, it's basically when an abducted person or an abducted child becomes sort of infatuated with their kidnapper, because essentially that kidnapper is their lifeline. They rely on that kidnapper to keep them alive, and somehow that sort of creates this infatuation. I kind of get it in a way, because you're literally, your life is dependent and reliant on that person, so they have a lot of power over you. I don't want to say he definitely had that, but I think it's definitely a possibility. So in 1980, at this point, Stephen was 14 years old, so he's growing up into a young man. And as disgusting as this sounds, and I hate to say it, it's part of the case, Kenneth started to lose his attraction to Stephen. He had been molesting him for years. The thing about Kenneth is that he was attracted to really young boys, prepubescent boys is what he said. So as Stephen starts growing up into a teenager, he's not attracted to him anymore. So that is when he decided that he needed a new child. So of course he did what he did best. He manipulated Stephen into trying to abduct a child for him. And this happened quite a few times, where Kenneth would send Stephen out to try and find a child for him, or they'd scope the area. And Stephen would pretend to go and try and abduct a child, but he would always mess it up on purpose, because he did not want to put another child through what he had been through. But Kenneth just thought that he was really bad at kidnapping. He didn't necessarily clock on to the fact that he was messing them up on purpose. So that is when he decided to get a new recruit into finding him a child to abduct. Now, this is crazy, but Kenneth somehow became friends with one of Stephen's classmates, another boy who was probably around 14, 15. And he didn't tell him why, but he basically said to this boy, whose name was Randall, if you abduct me a child, then I will give you drugs, I will give you alcohol, cigarettes, and basically, you know, most 15-year-olds' dreams, well, not drugs, but drinks and alcohol and stuff like that. He decided that he was going to do this for him. So Kenneth actually had his eye on a particular child, a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White. He lived in Ukiah, California, which was close to where they were living at the time. But Kenneth and Randall were driving around, and they spotted the little boy playing in his front garden or his front yard, and Randall gets out. Again, Kenneth will never get out himself and try and do these, he will always get the other person. So Randall gets out of the car and goes up to Timothy and pretends that he needs help, and Timothy, even though he's only 5, he says no, and then he decides to walk off to go inside of his house. But Randall literally runs over to the little boy, chases him against a chain fence and picks him up, kicking and screaming, and takes him back to the car where Kenneth is waiting. And again, no one saw this abduction, unfortunately. So shortly after, Timmy was not found. His parents panicked and called the police as well. So he was taken back to Kenneth and Stephen's home and was told that he was Timmy's new dad, and the same thing he told Stephen, that his parents didn't want him anymore. And he introduced Stephen as Timmy's new older brother. And this really affected Stephen on a level, seeing another defenseless child being brought into this world of abuse that he'd grown up in. And he became really, really close with Timmy, and they had a quite strong bond. So much so that he absolutely refused to let Kenneth put a hand on Timmy. He would come home from school early every day so that he'd be there before Kenneth was there, to make sure that he didn't lay a finger on him. Kenneth proceeded to dye Timothy's hair brown because he was light blonde, and change his appearance. And of course, he was a 5-year-old boy, so he was screaming and crying for his mum and his dad. And Stephen really sort of took on that role of the protective older brother and tried to look after him as best as he could. And just 2 weeks after Timothy was abducted, something really kicked in for Stephen, and he knew that he had to save this child from what he had been through himself. So one evening, Kenneth was working the night shift at his security job, and that is when Stephen decided to leave the home with Timmy and go back to Ukiah, California, to reunite him with his parents. So they had to hitchhike from a truck driver to get back to Ukiah, and when they got there, they realised that they didn't know Timmy's address. He was 5 years old, he didn't know it, and of course neither did Stephen. So the next best thing for him to do was to go to the closest police station, and he wanted Timmy to go in and tell the police who he was. But you know what's so sad is that Stephen wanted Timmy to go in by himself, and he didn't want to go in either. And I just think he was a kidnapped child. He was 14 years old. He was taken when he was 7, and he didn't have that urge to go to the police and tell them who he was. It's just so sad to think about. So he asked Timmy to go up to the police station, but Timmy really didn't want to leave Stephen. He was scared, he was afraid. So as he walked up, he then ran straight back to Stephen and held his hand, and the two boys were just kind of standing outside the police department. And then this caught the eye of one of the officers, and this officer just thought something was up, so he asked them both to come inside. And Stephen told the police who Timothy was, and that he had been found and that he'd saved him, basically. And the police started asking, well, who are you? Like, where do you come from? And after much hesitation, Stephen finally admitted the truth. And the line he said to the police was, "All I know is my first name is Stephen," which has gone on to be a ridiculously famous quote. It's the name of his book and a TV series and film that was made after this story. And it's just heartbreaking, isn't it, for him to say, "I know my first name is Stephen." He didn't even remember his last name. It's just so sad. I honestly can't. Like, if that doesn't break your heart, I don't know what will. So Timmy was reunited with his family. He was only gone for 2 weeks, be it a very, very traumatic 2 weeks. But the great news is that he was never actually sexually abused by Kenneth, because he hadn't had the chance to yet, thanks to Stephen. And of course, Stephen was reunited with his family after 7 years. They were immediately in the paper, and Stephen was praised a hero. He genuinely was a hero. He done the most selfless thing ever by saving this little boy and reuniting him to his family. So Stephen Stayner was a huge name in Merced at that point of time. Timmy's family even sent Stephen around £10,000 to £15,000 just to say thank you. Stephen had obviously told the police who Kenneth Parnell was, so the next day Kenneth was actually tracked down by police and arrested on suspicion of kidnapping of the two boys. It's crazy because this all kind of happened in California, and Kenneth Parnell was a registered sex offender, and I know nowadays that when a child goes missing, I'm 99% sure that they check the local areas for like the registered sex offenders and like rule them out. Obviously that's not something they did back then, which is a huge shame because this could have potentially been avoided. So that next summer, Kenneth Parnell went to court and he was charged and arrested for the kidnapping of the two boys, but he wasn't charged for the hundreds of sexual assaults that he caused Stephen, which is just so bad. He abused him for a long time and he wasn't actually arrested on this charge. The reason for this was because the sexual assaults had occurred outside of the jurisdiction of the Merced County prosecutor, and they took place outside of the statute of limitations. So all in all, with these charges, Kenneth Parnell was sentenced to 7 years in prison, which is just absolutely outrageous. But the worst part is that he only ended up serving 5 years and then was released on parole. Interestingly, the legislation surrounding kidnapping and convictions changed after this case, and this was to ensure offenders serve consecutive sentences for each offence. So that's good in some sense, I suppose, but it's just absolutely ludicrous that he wasn't charged for literally sexually abusing a child. Edwin Murphy, the man who actually lured Stephen all them years ago, was also given a sentence for his part, but it was something ridiculous like 2 years or something like that. And the teenage boy Randall received next to nothing for his part in kidnapping Timothy. And Barbara Mathias, the one that moved in with Kenneth and Stephen when he was 9, was not charged with anything, even though she allegedly sexually abused him herself. So there was not really justice done in this case. However, Stephen later went on to say that he actually appreciated Edwin Murphy during his first few weeks and months of captivity, and he didn't hold really anything against him for what he did. He actually felt quite sorry for him because he saw him as just as much of a victim to Kenneth Parnell as himself. I think the reason being because it was clear that Edwin had learning difficulties and he wasn't of sound mind completely. And when he did have Stephen in his presence, he was very kind and very nice towards him. And I think that's something that Stephen would have really needed in them initial moments of being abducted. So I think that's why he said that, as crazy as it sounds. So it all seems like happy endings, right? Timothy goes home, Stephen goes home to his parents, and I wish that was kind of the end of it, but sadly that's just not. So Stephen didn't really adjust well back into his life with his parents and his siblings. I'm sure when they were initially reunited, it was amazing and the parents were overjoyed and happy, of course. But can you imagine how surreal that would be to return home to your parents as now a 5'10", 14-year-old teenager who's got hormones and going through puberty, and you've been through this horrible ordeal? It's not as simple as just, oh, let's give each other a hug and let's snap back into life and reality. He had missed so many years with his family and he didn't know how to adjust back into society again. He, of course, should have had therapy, but he actually wasn't given any because his dad said he didn't need it. I have no idea why, but that is something that you should absolutely seek therapy for. His younger sister said that he actually was really fucked up after he started going through life, which I can completely understand. He had a lot of issues because he had been growing up in an environment where he could drink and smoke and come and go as he pleases, and now he's come back to normal rules like a 14-year-old has, and he can't do any of these things. So that was a massive shock as well, and having to just have rules and listen to his parents, and you know, it was just so much to adjust to. Because he did start drinking and stuff like that, this caused a lot of tension with his parents, and they started to argue a lot, and his dad actually kicked him out of the house at one point. And one of the saddest parts is that when he went back to high school, he was actually bullied for the fact that he'd been sexually abused as a child, and kids made fun of it, which is just so heartless. I don't understand that, but he just had such a hard time like coming back into his life. He got kicked out by his dad, and then he starts getting bullied at school, and as a result of that he eventually left school too. But things did eventually get a lot better for Stephen. As he grew older into a young man, he started working. He had a job at a pizza place. And when he was 20, he met a woman called Jodie Edmonton, who was 17 at the time. They went on to stay together for a few years, and they actually had 2 children. He had a daughter named Ashley and a son named Stephen Jr. He began giving talks about his abduction, about what he had been through, and, you know, offering some support to children, talking about stranger danger, all of that stuff. And his life was really starting to turn around. Then one day on September 16th, 1989, Stephen was on his way home from work, and he was driving his motorbike, and he had a full-on collision with a car in the road, and he sustained serious injuries from this and was later pronounced dead. He was just 24 years old. This is what really breaks my heart about this case, is that how is it fair that some people are born into this life with such terrible fate? I mean, what are the chances of being abducted as a child, being abused, going through hell, to then regaining some of your life, to then be killed by a car, but to then be hit by a car at 24 years old? It's just absolutely unbelievable. I really can't stop thinking about this. Like, why did that have to happen? It's just so unlucky. It's just so sad. At Stephen's funeral, there was around 500 people, and he was hailed a hero for obviously what he did all them years back. And Timothy was actually at the funeral, and he was aged 14 now, and he's actually one of the people that carried his coffin, and that just absolutely breaks me. I mean, how sad. Timothy had adjusted slightly better back into reality, as he was only 5 when he was abducted, and he was only gone for 2 weeks. Not that it's not traumatic, but it wasn't as long as Stephen, so because he was quite young, he was able to kind of adjust back into life. And eventually he grew up to be a deputy sheriff, which I think is absolutely amazing, and he always remembered Stephen as a hero, as did the rest of the town. He also went on to get married and have children, but sadly on the 1st of April 2010, Timothy suffered from a pulmonary embolism and passed away at age 35 after marrying and having children. And again, I can't get my brain around why these 2 boys who went through absolute hell and back how they died so young, both before the age of 40. They suffered. It's just unbelievable. Sorry I keep going on, but it is really just unbelievable. Life is so unfair. I don't think I'll ever get over this. But just to leave things on a slightly positive note, something I thought was just unbelievably amazing was that in the town where this all happened, there is now a statue of Timothy and Stephen that is still there to this day, which honours the journey that these 2 boys went through. And I think that is just a beautiful way to end this story. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I can't believe it. But I'm just sort of honoured that I was able to tell this story, really. So yeah, I've got nothing else to say on that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye.